This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers with K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken begins today's show. This week, they focus on opossums and why people are likely seeing more of them on the road. K-State wheat production specialist Romulo Lollato keeps today's show rolling as he talks through wheat planting dates and what growers need to consider before entering the field to plant. The show wraps up with K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk as he encourages dairy farmers to take biosecurity measures to help prevent the transfer of HPAI from birds, small animals, and other sources to the herd. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our show with another part of an episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers with K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken.
Welcome back to another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers. It's that glorious time of year, Drew. We're starting to get cooler weather a little bit. Lots of critters moving. It's hunting season. Dove season opened up. That's exciting. And enough rambling. You're gonna chat with us today, I guess, about some of the changes that we might be seeing, around the countryside. Thinking about the critters a little bit, we see when we're driving all the time is roadkill, right? And so that seems like it's changing this time of year. Is there anything to that, or am I just being more observant?
No, there definitely is. Yeah, a lot of the mammals that we see moving around the landscape a lot, they'll do what we call fall dispersal. And so, the youngins that they've been raising from springtime up until now, August, September, early October, those youngins are starting to think about finding their own home, or maybe mom and dad are kicking them out. They're not just thinking about finding their own home. Mom and dad have decided it's time for you to move on. You're taking up resources and I don't want you here anymore. So they start moving around a lot more, which means that they're crossing roads a lot more, which means that they're going to get hit more. And of course, when we see lots of roadkill, we also end up seeing roadkill of the critters that are scavenging on that roadkill too. And so that made me think about opossums. And I also really, the main thing I wanted to talk about today was opossums. And, opossums are what we would call an opportunistic generalist, and that is about the broadest category of a diet you could have, because we're sort of lumping two things in there that say that they eat just about anything. We've talked a little bit about the cleanup crew. They're definitely part of that cleanup crew that's important. We'd be covered up with dead bodies and dead plant parts if we didn't have those cleanup critters out there. So they're definitely important because of that.
So they like to eat a lot of things. One of the things that I've heard, and I don't know if this is true or not, but I've heard that possums love to eat ticks, right? And so attracting them so that they can eat the ticks in our yard, is that true? Any bearing to that?
So there's a very prominent study where they brought some opossums into the lab and they put larval ticks on those opossums. They gave them time to attach and then drop off after they have had a blood meal, which is what a tick wants to do. Of course, we want to find them on us before they have a chance to get almost popping size and then fall off on their own. But in this study, they documented a few ticks that got that blood meal and then fell off of the opossums. And then at the end, they tried to find ticks left over on the opossums, and they basically didn't find very many at all. And so their assumption was that all the ticks that they put on them were eaten, which it's likely that's what happened if they weren't anywhere else. But we're assuming that opossums act the same way when we bring them into a lab and stick them into a cage as they do when they're out in the wild. And sort of an interesting counter result to that is there's quite a few diet studies out there that have looked at stomach contents of ticks, and there's been a couple fairly recent ones that
stomach contents of possums.
Yes, sorry, stomach contents of opossums, not stomach contents of ticks, but their goal was to identify whether or not ticks were an important part of the diet of opossums. And there's not a study out there that shows that opossums eat ticks.
Oh, wow.
And there's also, in a lot of these same studies, the opossums had ticks on them. And there are some studies that report that the average opossum might have 50 plus ticks on it. So
quite a few.
Yeah, thinking about opossums as being this sort of terminal trap for ticks, if they get on an opossum, the opossums are going to eat them and they're going to go away, or even going farther than that, like a lot of people have done, and thinking that if I have opossums in my yard that they're going to go out there and just forage on all the ticks. It's probably not a good way to think about it. And I think that brings up another thing, that when we feed wildlife, especially when we feed wildlife in our yard, we can oftentimes cause problems for ourselves or our neighbors that we didn't really intend to. And, I end up helping a lot of folks who are having issues with pets getting into fights with opossums or skunks or raccoons on a porch. Well, oftentimes what's led to that is we've had cat food or dog food out on the porch. Maybe we're putting scraps out trying to feed the wildlife. Or we've got a bird feeder in the yard that's attracting all these critters to the yard. And there's some studies that show that these animals that like to eat birdseed, like raccoons, and opossums weren't a part of the study that I'm talking about because it was too far north, but opossums would be another one of those species. Skunks would be too, coyotes, foxes. They're attracted to our yard when we have a bird feeder out there if we got lots of food on the ground. And so a really easy way to avoid conflicts with critters like opossums and raccoons is to minimize that food that's available out there. Don't intentionally feed them. These animals have enough food. They can get enough food on their own. But, when we do that sort of thing, we're also attracting them, and we're sort of asking to have problems around our house.
Yeah, some of the problems around our house. What about, in an agricultural setting? Are they have any impact on livestock or anything like that?
They can, yeah. So the biggest impact that most people think about from opossums with livestock is really more like backyard poultry flocks. I get a lot of calls from folks who have opossums and similarly sized animals that are killing chickens. Again, that's a really easy situation to avoid. I think we've had this sort of movement about two things. One, backyard flocks of poultry, which I think are great. And at the same time, we've had this big movement for free-range poultry. And one of the big challenges with that is those are pretty vulnerable animals, and you got to protect them. So if we're just turning chickens or guineas or ducks out in the yard and not doing anything to protect them, we don't have really good fencing around the yard. We really ought to have overhead fence over that to keep other things like birds of prey from getting in there and getting them. Bobcats will actually jump over 6-foot dog panels and grab chickens and then jump back out. I've got some video of that people have shared with me. So we've got to protect our poultry. And even if we are protecting them in a pen, it's important to think about the fact that opossums can get through a hole. If we're thinking about maybe the size of a baseball, that's plenty big for your average opossum in Kansas to get through. So they can get through that. They can also climb up just about anything. With the opossums killing poultry, we're typically not just going to see poultry that totally disappears. That's probably a bigger predator. A lot of times they will start eating around the vent area, or what we would think about as the anus, the cloaca on a bird. They start feeding on that area. They might pull some intestines out. Sometimes you might actually see a live chicken walking around with its intestines hanging out because of something like that. So they're going to start feeding on the back end. Sometimes with opossums, you might see them chewing up the necks and not eating anything else. That tends to be more of a sign that we had maybe a raccoon around or something like that. The opossums usually will target those guts and that cloaca area.
So when they're reproducing, they're marsupials, right? And that's a unique characteristic for these individuals. I think they're the only one in North America. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's true. So the Virginia opossum is the only North American opossum. And it's important to talk about their common name a little bit, I guess, too, when we're talking about this. So there are possums, and then there are opossums. But if you live in the Great Plains or the Midwest, you wouldn't think so. You'd think there's just possums, right? But in the Americas, in the New World, so South America and in North America, we have opossums. There's several different species of opossums in South America, and they're all marsupials, which means they have a pouch, means they have really underdeveloped, or scientists would call that altricial young. So those newborn opossums are very, very underdeveloped. They actually crawl from the vagina to the pouch. Their lips fuse to the skin around a nipple inside the pouch of that female, and they're basically attached to that nipple while they continue to develop. And so they're hairless, their eyes aren't open, and that's a characteristic that all marsupials share. That's a very old characteristic if we're thinking about the evolutionary time scale of mammals. As mammals have become more adapted through time, another thing that we've seen is the number of teeth that they have has been reduced because they've become more adapted. So opossums have 50 teeth. That's the most of any terrestrial mammal in North America too. So that's another interesting fact about them.
What about playing dead? Is that, or playing possum? We've heard that before. Why do they do that?
Well, everything, all critters have some sort of defense mechanism when they're threatened by a predator. And opossum is going to act like it's dead and count on the fact that a predator is going to lose interest if they're not fighting back and that they're dead already. Some predators kill as much because they're wanting to play with something as they do because they're hungry. And that's something that opossums have definitely learned to do, and will do it just about every time. I mean, not every time they're threatened. I've had opossums run away from me when I've tried to catch them. And please, if you're listening, do not intentionally try and catch opossums. I'm a trained biologist and I know how to do these things. But I've caught quite a few opossums by hand because of the fact that they will play dead, and it can allow you, if you know what you're doing, to get a hold of them.
We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about wheat planting, as this could be getting close for some people. And then to talk about it, we're joined by K-State Wheat Production Specialist Romulo Lollato. Romulo, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Shelby. Thank you for having me.
Romulo, as we're thinking about wheat planting, sometimes growers have different goals, and so how can that affect the planting recommendations?
Yeah, that's a great question. And really depending on the goal of that production system or even where the producer is in the state, kind of that optimum planting date changes, right? And so if we kind of start with regional, right, where growers are and when they should be thinking about planting, in the western part of the state, of course, it gets colder much sooner in the fall because they have much higher elevations up there. And also producers tend to be more opportunistic out there because it's such a drier environment that perhaps they have a chance of rain, they'll try to get it done. But whenever you think of the optimum, if we think like it's going to be much earlier in that Colby or Northwest Kansas region, our optimum goal there would be about September 25th. I like to think that in that region, that September 25th is a pretty good goal, and that's based on long-term data that we looked at here in the recent few years. And if we get to the other extreme of the state, right, like South Central Kansas, I'm very comfortable going as late as about October 15th or so in terms of being the optimal planting date, right? So it is a later planting date. And not only that, it also has a different yield penalty as we delay planting, right? So in the western, northwest part of the state, as we're delaying planting, say past October 10th or so, we have a pretty steep reduction in our yield potential out there, maybe 2-3 bushels per acre per day. Whereas in South Central Kansas, again, because it is a warmer region and perhaps with more rainfall as well, the environment tends to be more forgiving. And many times our yield penalty doesn't start until sometime in early November. And we're maybe looking at like a bushel per acre per day or something along those lines, right? So really there is an optimum. It's kind of like a curve, right, where we have the peak. And again, that peak goes from as early as about September 25th in the western, northwest part of the state to as late as about mid-October in the south central part of the state. Now, that's geography, right? When it comes to production system, as you were mentioning in the beginning there, Shelby, some growers will grow wheat for dual purpose. That means grains and plus grains. And when we're looking at dual purpose, we're not only looking at our grain yield, we're also wanting forage production. And so kind of the earlier we go, the more forage production we tend to produce, because the crop gets exposed to warmer temperatures out there in the fall. And so usually we say about 2 to 3 weeks before that optimum date that I just gave you a little while ago is when we would be going for dual purpose. So if we're talking about the western part of the state, probably about this time, right? Still, I think it's a little bit too early if you're going for grain only, but if you're going for dual purpose, it's probably about time. Now, if you go more to the south central part of the state, we still can wait a good maybe 10, 15 days and we'll still be in pretty good shape still for grazing, right? And so it really depends where we are planting the crop. It also depends on the purpose of that crop, because in dual purpose systems, we want to balance forage production with grain yield as well.
And there are some disease risk if it gets planted maybe a little too early?
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, right, the wheat yield response to planting date is a curve, right? It's like a curve that goes up and then it goes down. And so that optimum is where we minimize the risks for that crop. But if we're planting too early or too late, we have concerns on both ends of that curve. If we're planting too early, most of the concerns, they would be related to some viral diseases that we have increased risks. Let's remember that some of those viral diseases, like wheat streak mosaic virus, for example, or barley yellow dwarf virus, they would be transmitted by living organisms, right? In the case of wheat streak mosaic, the wheat curl mite, they would be more active early in the fall when it's warmer. Kind of same thing with barley yellow dwarf, right? They're going to be transmitted by aphids, which is going to be more active early in the fall, the earlier we plant. We also have some concerns with potential for like a passion fly infestation as well as army worms. So whenever we're planting too early, we do have these concerns that relate more to transmission of diseases or to direct pest damage. Another concern is also related to crop emergence itself. And what do I mean by that? Some varieties, they are what we call temperature germination sensitive, meaning that if we're planting in warm soils, they might just not germinate until there's a rain that comes and cools things down, right? And so we need to keep that in mind, right? And if we're reaching for moisture and try to go deep, another concern of planting early is the coleoptile length of those varieties. Warmer temperatures, they reduce the coleoptile length of those varieties. So if we're planting too deep to try to reach for moisture in a warm soil, chances are that, depending on variety, we might not get a crop emergence because the coleoptile will be shortened and the first true leaf might come up still below ground. Then perhaps finally, one other thing that can reduce our grain yields if we're planting too early, it's related to excessive fall growth. And we saw this last season, right? This immediate last season, the harvest of 2024. What happened then? The fall was fairly open. There was some good temperature accumulation in the fall, and there was some moisture out there in the fall as well, kind of throughout the state. And that allowed the crop to really grow a good amount. We were measuring forage productions north of 2,000 pounds of dry matter per acre, whereas some past years we have measured as little as 500 pounds, right? And so there was a good amount of biomass produced in the fall. Now, the concern there was in the spring, winter and spring, they were so dry that the crop that had that lusher growth and more biomass in the fall ended up using too much of that water early on, and it really dried out the profile for later in the season when it truly needed to make grain yield, needed some of that moisture. On the back end of the season there in April and May, things were so dry that the crop that was bigger in the fall, it turned out to go through much more drought stress and had a lot more yield penalty from that drought stress because of that excessive growth. Really, these are a few things here that we need to be concerned if we're going to plant too early, right? It also increases the risk of some diseases like take-all or dryland foot rot and common root rot. Usually, they are worse on early planted wheat. So there are a number of things here that can be worse in early planted wheat, and that's the reason why, again, I think of planting date and grain yield relations, we have that curve that often is going to minimize these risks that we just talked about for early planting here. Of course, if we're planting too late, we are on the other side of that window, and there are yield-reducing factors on that other side as well. It may be a little bit too early to talk about them now, but essentially, we just don't have enough temperature in the fall for enough tiller production, and so we're delaying that planting or delaying tillering or delaying maturity of that crop as well, exposing it to greater risks of heat stress later on. So again, just trying to summarize here where's our optimum planting date across the state? Range there from that late September in Northwest all the way to mid-October in South Central. and how much yield we lose by going too early or too late, and why we're losing that yield from going too early. Another thing just to have in mind if you're planting early is that there are some varieties out there that have a shorter vernalization requirement. Vernalization is how many weeks of cold temperature does the crop need before it takes on spring growth, right? Before it actually meets those requirements and turn into reproductive development rather than vegetative. And in those varieties that have a short vernalization requirement, they tend to really increase their spring growth fairly early. So they will be more exposed to freeze damage, right? So if we're planting them early, chances are that we're going to meet those requirements early as well. And perhaps those varieties can be more exposed to freeze damage later on. So just that's something to keep in mind, a few concerns of planting too early that growers should have in mind right now. If they're not going for grazing, my advice would probably still wait a little bit more, perhaps, another couple of weeks for the northwest part of the state. And from there, later and later, as we come to the south central part of the state, and we're still in really good shape in terms of trying to attain our yield potential for this season.
And when it comes to wheat planting, weather also a really big aspect. And so in ideal conditions, what would the weather look like for wheat planting, Romulo?
In an ideal situation right now, which is, we're about 2 weeks before wheat planting, right? We would have done our control of volunteer wheat, meaning that we have had some rain a couple of weeks back. All that volunteer emerged, and we had a good chance to go out there and get a good control of those volunteer wheat plants, so that we reduce our chances for wheat streak mosaic virus transmission later in the season. Then can actually get that crop into a profile that allows us to get it on time, perhaps with some moisture in the profile, not necessarily in the topsoil, but with a good, nice, low rain shower right after that planting to really ensure good emergence, right? That would be ideal scenario. And then from there, also in a fall that allows for enough temperature for the crop to produce at least 4 or 5 tillers now in the fall, which will be the most productive tillers. We have had seasons when cold spell happened fairly early in the fall, and the crop did not have the chance to tiller. We have had seasons where there was no rainfall in the fall to get the crop emerged. So many things can go wrong, even in the fall now, that the crop doesn't get off to a good start. But again, in an ideal scenario, we have had enough moisture for our volunteer to come up, control the volunteer so that it's dead 2 weeks before planting, reducing our chances of wheat streak mosaic. And we have enough more moisture for germination. We don't need a whole lot, but at least a good half an inch or more for a good germination now in the fall. And decent temperatures for 4 or 5 tillers produced in the fall, so that we have good root production and good tiller production for going into the winter with greater chances of reducing any potential for winter yield.
That was K-State Wheat Production Specialist Romulo Lollato. I will link a recent Agronomy e-update article titled Wheat Planting, Be Cautious of Planting Too Early in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but stick around because we'll have more for you ahead.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. Kansas dairy producers haven't seen a widespread outbreak of HPAI, a viral disease that can infect many types of birds. However, the risk still exists. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk is encouraging dairy producers to implement biosecurity measures on farm that can reduce the transmission of HPAI.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning HPAI, or what we commonly know as bird flu. As we look at the fall and the return of migratory birds, it might be a little more on your minds as a dairy producer. Things have been very quiet here in the state of Kansas. Our last reported case was back in April. So haven't had huge problems here in the state of Kansas, with only a total of 4 positive herds since it was first detected here in the Midwest toward the end of March. So as we look forward, what are some things that you need to be thinking about? Well, number one, as we look at what we do with biosecurity, we got to think about how it might come onto our farm. And I wish we had more information and maybe more specific information about this, but we have to deal with what we have and try to move forward. So the first detections were transfer from waterfowl or other birds to dairy cattle. So trying to eliminate birds on your farm. One particular concern we might have here in Kansas would be starlings, as they tend to congregate on our dairies for feeding or roosting. So trying to prevent this from happening would be an important method of biosecurity that you could use on your dairy to ensure that we don't have transmission through birds. Some other things that have shown to possibly cause the transfer of this virus into naive herds is the introduction of animals from other places. This could be from a heifer grower, it could be from purchase animals. Although we're not sure exactly the mode of transmission, it does seem that the movement of new animals into a dairy have resulted in some spread in some cases. So you need to protect your herd the best you can in those situations. And of course, with the recent changes that we've had in regulations here in the state of Kansas, any animal that's lactating coming into the state has to be tested for HPAI prior to movement. However, heifers or animals that are non-lactating are not required to be tested. So if you're moving heifers in from other places, even other farms within the state of Kansas, you could be at risk for transfer to your herd should these animals bring the virus with them. Some other things that we have found to transfer the virus include small animals such as cats, raccoons, skunks. It's also been detected in mice, so there are a number of things that could spread this virus to your dairy that you may have a little more difficulty controlling on your dairy. Some of the other things that have been suspected in some of the transfers has been humans sharing workers or workers that share housing and transfer between herds as well as transfer between birds and herds have also been detected in a few cases. So be aware of where your workers might be coming from and who they might be associating with in their living environments and how that might possibly impact your dairy as well. It is also possible that this virus travels by aerosol or through the wind, could be transported by trucks and other vehicles coming on the farm. It could be transported by other humans, such as veterinarians, breeding personnel. Those that are traveling between farms could possibly bring this onto your farm. Again, I wish we had more accurate information as to what you would need to actually eliminate from your dairy to ensure that it doesn't transfer to your dairy. But these are just the few of the things that have been noted in some cases, but not all cases, where the influenza has been detected in dairy herds. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy producers to continue to be on the lookout for HPAI signs in their herds and do what you can do to eliminate the possible spread through increased biosecurity measures on your dairy.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.